Today, we're diving into the hidden connections that literally hold our world together, and more importantly, what happens when those connections start to fall apart. Let's get right into it. Okay, so here's a question for you. What could a chemical used on a farm possibly have to do with your bones? It sounds totally random, I know, but the answer pulls back the curtain on this powerful, invisible story. A story about how one single action can ripple through an entire system and, yeah, end up affecting your personal health.
To really wrap our heads around this, we have to start with this big idea, this concept of the ripple effect, which is so often completely invisible to us.
Now, scientists have a specific name for this. They call it a cascade event. And honestly, the best way to picture it is like a line of dominoes. You push one over, maybe it's a new chemical or a change in land use, and that starts a chain reaction. But here's the crazy part. Unlike dominoes, this breakdown can happen silently, over years and years, which makes it almost impossible to trace back to that first little push.
So let's see this in action. Our first case study is basically an ecological detective story, and it all begins with a creature you've probably never given much thought to, the snail.
So this is what we're calling the Calcium Cascade. It's the whole chain of events laid out for us. It kicks off with chemicals wiping out snails, which messes up the soil, which then starves the food chain of a vital nutrient. And, you guessed it, it ultimately lands right at our doorstep. Let's break down exactly how this happens.
You see, snails have this incredibly important but totally hidden job. They're essentially micro-mineral engineers. As they live their lives and eventually die, their shells, which are super rich in calcium, break down. And all that good stuff gets recycled right back into the soil. This makes that vital mineral available for plants to absorb and, down the line, for us to get from our food.
And this isn't just a theory, check this out. Research from rice paddies in South Asia showed the direct consequence. The plots treated with these chemicals, they had 15 to 20% less available calcium. I mean, that is a huge mineral deficit. You're literally weakening the very foundation of the food chain.
All right, let's move on to our next story. This time, we're looking at pollinators and how their decline, well, it hits us directly in our wallets and on our dinner plates. Just look at this number for a second. 75%. 3/4 of the entire world's food crops depend on these tiny little workers. Without bees and butterflies, our food system as we know it it doesn't work.
And one of the main drivers of their decline is a whole class of insecticides called neonicotinoids. For insects, they're basically neurotoxins. They don't just kill the pests they're intended for, they also hammer beneficial insects like bees, causing confusion, paralysis, and eventually death.
And just like with the snails, this kicks off another cascade. You can see the progression, right? First, you lose the pollinators. That means you get smaller harvests. And when there's less food to go around, the prices for healthy stuff like fruits and vegetables, they spike, pushing a lot of families towards cheaper, less healthy food.
And again, this is very real. A global analysis found a 13% average drop in yields for these specific crops over just the last 20 years. That is a direct hit to food security around the globe.
Okay, for our final case study, we're going to follow the water. We'll connect the dots from a farm field all the way to a river and see how pollution on land can create actual hunger for communities that depend on what lives in that water.
So this cascade starts with a process called eutrophication. It sounds complex, but it's actually pretty simple. Excess fertilizer runs off fields and into rivers. All those extra nutrients act like junk food for algae, which then explodes into these massive blooms. And when all that algae dies and rots, it sucks all the oxygen out of the water, creating dead zones where aquatic life simply can't survive.
So who's the first victim? The insects. In affected areas in Bangladesh, for example, the diversity of aquatic insects just plummeted by 60%. These little guys are the foundation of that whole ecosystem. They're the main food source for almost all the young fish.
So what happens when their food disappears? Take a look. The local fish populations crashed right along with them, falling by more than 45%. You can draw a straight line from the lack of insects to the lack of fish. It's a clear cause and effect reaction.
And this is where it hits home. For the people in rural communities who rely on these fish for affordable protein, this ecological collapse becomes a human tragedy. It directly causes malnutrition and food insecurity.
Seeing all these devastating impacts, it really makes you wonder, how do we even begin to track these silent, slow-moving disasters? How do we become the ecological detectives here?
Well, it turns out scientists and even regular people have a whole toolkit. It includes things like chemical tests for soil and water,
using drones to monitor changes over time, and even citizen science, where farmers keep detailed logs to track what's happening on their own land. But one of the most powerful tools is the use of what are called sentinel species.
I think this idea of living sensors is just fascinating. It's the modern version of the canary in the coal mine. The presence of something like mayflies tells you that the water is clean. If you've got lots of earthworms, your soil is healthy. When they start to disappear, it's a huge early warning sign that the entire system is in trouble.
And for an even deeper investigation, scientists can trace the problem at a chemical level. It's called stable isotope analysis. Think of it like a chemical fingerprint. It lets them follow a specific pollutant from the soil, into a plant, into the animal that eats that plant, and all the way up the food chain. It allows them to map the exact pathway of the contamination.
Okay, so understanding the problem is the first step, but the most important part of this story is that these cascades, they can be reversed. So how do we start rebuilding these broken chains?
The answer lies in working with nature, not against it. We're talking about solutions like planting corridors of wildflowers for pollinators, using natural ways to manage pests, and creating buffer zones of plants and trees along rivers to filter that runoff. These aren't some complicated high-tech fixes. It's all about restoring the natural balance and complexity that made the ecosystem resilient in the first place.
So we've seen how the health of a tiny snail connects all the way to our bones, and how the flight of a single bee connects to our dinner table. It's a powerful reminder that every ecosystem is this intricate, interconnected chain of life. So the final question is, now that you know this, which link will you choose to protect?